Hello and welcome to the Shifting the Paradigm webinar series, where we build community knowledge, skills, confidence and understanding of child sexual exploitation. We hope that you find this webinar beneficial.
Thank you for being here today, and thanks to Hayley and the team at Project Paradigm for inviting me and organising everything. Before I begin, I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're meeting today, and for me that's the Gubbi Gubbi Cubbi Cubbi peoples, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and I also extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples that might be joining us here today. So as was mentioned, my name is Dr. Bricklyn Priebe. I'm an Associate Lecturer in Criminology and Justice at the University of the Sunshine Coast. I've been teaching and researching in criminology for about 12 years now, and much of my work sits within the sexual violence space, exploring offending behaviour and rehabilitation and prevention. Throughout my career so far, I've been drawn to really practical questions. So understanding why people offend, it's always fascinated me, but I'm equally interested in what people are actually doing out in the field. So what supports exist, what interventions are available, how are practitioners responding, and where are the gaps between policy, theory, and practice? So today I want to share findings from my program of research examining women who have been convicted of child sexual abuse offences. Much of what I'm going to discuss today comes out of my PhD. So that involved a series of somewhat interconnected studies exploring rehabilitation and prevention, particularly within the Australian context. So across the project, I spoke with 18 women who were convicted of child sexual abuse offences, and they were recruited from 3 Australian jurisdictions. Almost all of those women were currently serving a custodial sentence, ranging between 18 months up to 28 years. I also interviewed 25 practitioners who are responsible for assessing and treating and supervising and supporting women who commit these offences. So these included Australian correctional practitioners working within those same jurisdictions from which the women were recruited, and also included therapeutic practitioners working in non-government affiliated positions across Australia, as well as Canada, the United Kingdom, New Zealand, and Europe. So these 43 interviews, they were analyzed using what's called thematic analysis. So for those that are unfamiliar with that approach, basically it just means a lot of reading. Thematic analysis, it focuses on identifying patterns. And for me, it involved exploring how the people I was speaking with made sense of and described their experiences. So rather than testing predetermined hypotheses, I did this inductively. So basically, I moved back and forth through those 43 interview transcripts, looking for recurring themes, looking for points of difference and broader patterns of meaning. Different analyses were then undertaken to look for specific questions that I had related to rehabilitation access, content, structure, implementation, and prevention. I just wanted to clarify early on that the content that I'm about to share with you today, it largely comes from this broader same set of interviews. So although I'll discuss findings across 5 different publications and studies, many are drawing from this interview data of those 43 interviews in total, just analysed through different lenses. So on this slide, I've put the 5 publications that came from this work. So the first one explored whether women convicted of child sexual abuse in Australia are able to access meaningful treatment and support, and whether offence-specific intervention is needed. The second examined what those interventions should actually address, so focusing on the treatment needs that were identified by women and identified by practitioners. The third study, it moved beyond treatment content to consider delivery instead. So asking what effective and what engaging intervention might look like in practice. And the fourth focused on implementation. So that involved looking and exploring the barriers that prevent these approaches and these programs from being more widely available within correctional systems here in Australia. The fifth study, the final one, it shifted the focus upstream to prevention. So asking women to reflect on their lives and reflect on what support, what services or opportunities may have helped earlier in their lives. Now, given the time that's available today, I'm not going to be able to cover every finding from every one of these publications, but I just included them on this slide for anyone that might be interested in exploring the work in more detail after this webinar. Now, before I get into the findings, I just wanted to briefly set the scene and explain what led me to this research. Now, I'm conscious that many of you have very extensive knowledge and experience and expertise in this area, so I don't want to spend too much time revisiting what's already quite well established, but I think it is important to highlight a few points that really shaped the direction of my work specifically. So when I began looking at existing literature on women who commit child sexual abuse, I kept encountering the same issue. Now, there was a growing discussion about female offending pathways, but there was far less discussion about intervention, particularly in Australia, where there was almost nothing on what treatment should look like, what services were available, whether existing approaches were meeting women's needs. Perhaps most importantly, there was next to no research on what might prevent women from reaching that point in the first place. Now, traditionally, sexual offending, it's been viewed as a predominantly male crime, and statistically, men do account for the majority of detected cases. But women, they're responsible for a small but significant proportion of child sexual abuse offences, somewhere between 2 up to 20% of incidents, depending on the source that you're looking at. And it is generally accepted that this is very much an underreported and underrecognized crime. There definitely has been growing recognition of female perpetrated child sexual abuse, but it still is an area that remains characterized by a lot of misunderstanding and stereotypes and quite significant gaps in knowledge. Now, part of the challenge is that female perpetrated abuse, it often doesn't fit social expectations. So it can therefore be minimized or overlooked or interpreted differently. Another challenge is most of what we know about sexual offending, it comes from research involving men. Most treatment programs were originally developed for men. Most risk assessment tools were developed for men. Most prevention conversations also focus on men. So the more that I was engaging with that existing literature, the more I found myself returning to a series of practical questions. If a woman enters the criminal justice system in Australia following a child sexual abuse conviction, what happens next? What intervention should she be receiving? What treatment needs should be prioritized? What should rehabilitation really look like? And how do we stop people reaching that point in the first place? So those questions became the foundation for this research program that I'm going to be discussing with you today. Now, given the very limited research on this topic here in Australia, my research took what's called an exploratory approach. So this approach involved listening and learning from those with relevant experiences and perspectives. And that included interviews with women who had committed these offences and practitioners working with them. The first questions I asked them were actually quite simple. I said, did women and practitioners, do they believe gender and offence-specific intervention was needed? And what benefits did they think that these types of programs might actually offer? One of the first things that I noticed in my interviews with these populations was that most people I spoke with, they initially bypassed the question about what gender responsive treatment should look like. Instead, they shared that there were issues with accessing any treatment at all. Several of the women who had perpetrated child sexual abuse, they described feeling like they'd simply fallen through the cracks when it came to rehabilitation. Most had never been offered offence-specific intervention. Others described waiting really long periods of time for support, and if and when the support came while they were in custody, many felt there was very little available that was actually relevant to their experiences and relevant to their needs. So one woman said simply, "We have nothing." Another woman said, "This is supposed to be a rehabilitation centre. Why are they not rehabilitating us?" Now, I think that captures something really important because regardless of where we might be sitting, philosophically on things like punishment and accountability and rehabilitation, if rehabilitation is one of the goals of our correctional system in Australia, which it is, there needs to be help available to support that process. So what struck me most about these accounts was that many women were wanting support and actively trying to seek it out. Many of these women described literally begging for help. They even begged me for help during my interviews with them, not because they thought it would help to reduce their sentence, not because they thought it would help their parole applications, or that's what they said to me, but because they wanted to understand what had happened. They wanted to understand themselves, and they wanted to reduce the likelihood of ever finding themselves in that position again. Now, practitioners, they were describing quite a similar problem. Many expressed frustration about the lack of available services for this population of women. Several explained that women sometimes occupy a different position within correctional systems. There are often too few women to justify dedicated programs, but there are enough women that their needs can't simply be overlooked. So one practitioner described women as falling into this service gap. So too few to attract a substantial investment, but too many to pretend that the issue just doesn't exist. So before I even started discussing with them what treatment should look like, there was already this fairly clear message emerging from my conversation with these groups, and that was that access itself is a problem. So this then led me to ask another question. I said, do these women who commit child sexual abuse, do they actually need offense-specific treatment programs, ones that are specific to women? Honestly, I didn't really know what the answer would be at that point in my journey. Part of me wondered whether practitioners would argue that existing generalized interventions were sufficient. I thought perhaps women could simply access programs that were designed for men with just a few adjustments maybe along the way. But that's not what I heard. One of the things that surprised me the most in this study was not the disagreement between the women I spoke with and the practitioners, but the extent to which they agreed. Across both of those groups, there was this remarkably consistent message that yes, there's a need for offense-specific intervention. Now, importantly, most of the people that I spoke with, they weren't necessarily arguing that women should be treated completely differently from men. That wasn't really the message. Instead, they suggested that women, they often arrive at treatment with different experiences and different challenges and different pathways into offending. So simply placing women into programs that originally were designed for men can mean that some of those really important issues are overlooked. So just as one example, one of the practitioners I spoke with said, the majority of sexual offenders are men, and therefore we make assumptions and just try and extrapolate. They're different. We need to understand them as different, and we need to be unapologetic about doing that. So my next question then became why? Why might offense-specific intervention for these women be beneficial? And how would these programs, if they were available to these women, help to serve a purpose? Initially, I expected that much of the discussion would focus on reducing reoffending, and that was definitely part of it. But many participants that I spoke with, they discussed something broader. So they talked about understanding, insight, reflection, making sense of their lives, making sense of their offending pathways. The women I spoke with, they repeatedly expressed a desire to understand why they ended up where they did. What factors had contributed, what warning signs were missed, what role had trauma played, what role had their own decisions played. So they wanted a space where those questions could be explored honestly and openly and safely, not to excuse their offending, not to avoid accountability, but to better understand it. And practitioners I spoke with, they generally echoed that sentiment as well. So many explained that meaningful change often requires insight, and insight requires opportunities for reflection. So if people don't understand the factors that contributed to their offending, it becomes much harder then to identify future risks and recognize vulnerabilities and develop strategies for change. The people I spoke with also talked about future planning. So many women, they wanted support rebuilding relationships, rebuilding their confidence, rebuilding a sense of identity, preparing for release, preparing for parenting, preparing for life after their time in a custodial correctional setting. So they weren't simply focused on the offense. They were focused on what came next in their lives. And this became one of the strongest themes across this broader program of research. Again and again, the participants, they pulled the conversation away from the offense itself and towards that broader context of these women's lives. So the conclusion from this first study was relatively clear that women and practitioners, they both supported the need for offense-specific, gender-responsive intervention. But perhaps the most important finding was that many women were still struggling to access any intervention at all. All right, so once it was established that these programs were needed, that these programs were supported, the next question became, what should they actually address? What are the treatment needs of women who commit child sexual abuse? And are those needs actually different from the needs of men? And that became the focus of my next analysis in this next study. So when I looked at the literature before doing this research, there was a lot of statements about gender responsive practice and how important it is. So I read countless statements that, we need gender responsive treatment or that women's pathways are different. And generally, I agree with this. But I kept finding myself asking, what does that actually mean? What does a therapist do differently? What type of conversations are they having? What topics are they covering? What should a program actually look like? So asking this of practitioners and the women convicted of these crimes was a really important priority area for me. So I asked them, if you were designing a program specifically for women convicted of child sexual abuse, what would it actually address? I then looked at how these participants described or how they emphasized how this would be different to treatment involving men who had perpetrated child sexual abuse. And I found that there were 5 themes. The first was trauma, then relationships, then sexuality, self-esteem, and parenting. What I found really interesting was that many of these themes, they're not necessarily unique to women. So men experience trauma, men have relationship difficulties, men struggle with self-esteem, and men can have parenting challenges. So the story wasn't that women are completely different. The story was that these issues, they often look different, they operate differently, and therefore they require a different therapeutic response for women. Okay, so the first theme was trauma. Now, I don't think I can really overstate how dominant this theme was across the interviews. Pretty much every practitioner I spoke with discussed trauma. The majority of the women did too. So many of them described childhoods that were characterized by abuse, neglect, violence, a lot of instability and victimization as well. Some women, they talked about being sexually abused by multiple people across their lives. Others described growing up in homes where violence and dysfunction were somewhat normalized. And what practitioners repeatedly told me was that trauma wasn't just something happening in the background. For many women, it appeared really central to their offending pathways. So one practitioner put it really simply. They said that for many women, offending was less about sexual interest and much more about trauma and relationship distortions instead, and that this operates very differently for women when compared with men. Now, I do want to be careful here that this is not about excusing the offending, and the women themselves, when I was speaking to them, were actually really clear about that as well. Many just wanted to understand the role that their life experiences had played in shaping who they became and what they did. And they wanted answers to those questions that I mentioned before, like, why did I do what I did? How did I get here? What vulnerabilities existed? And perhaps most importantly, how do I stop repeating those unhealthy patterns? One of the things that struck me was that many of the participants, they suggested the need to understand and work on women's trauma before, focusing heavily on the offense itself. So not instead of accountability, just before it. So practitioners and women, they both argued that women first need support understanding their own histories and understanding their own victimization experiences before they can meaningfully engage in conversations about the harm that they've caused others, and that this should be a core part of any program for women. And I found that really interesting because it challenged my own assumptions about where treatment should begin. I hadn't really given much thought to program sequencing before that, which is probably quite naive of me upon reflection, but it was a really important finding of this study. Now, the second theme was relationships. If trauma was a dominant theme, I think relationships were a very close second. Almost every practitioner described relationship difficulties as very much central to understanding many women's offending pathways. Importantly, they weren't just talking about unhealthy relationships, they were talking about relationship dependency, fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, fear of being alone. Many women that I spoke with, they described relationships characterized by control and coercion and manipulation and intimidation or abuse. Some women talked about direct violence from male partners, and they gave really horrific and specific details of very significant and long-term abuse. Others described something that was a little bit more subtle, a desire to please, a desire to keep the relationship, a desire not to be abandoned. One woman described that she always felt replaceable. Another described that she would do whatever she could to avoid being rejected. And what became clear was that many women, they weren't simply making decisions in isolation. Their offending was often occurring within this broader relationship dynamic that needed to be better understood. Again, not to, remove responsibility for these women, but it is about instead highlighting that treatment needs to address this topic for many women. So one of my favorite practitioner quotes from this study was that for men, we often want them to build healthy relationships with women. But for women, we want them to step out of relationships with men and learn to stand on their own 2 feet. And I remember hearing that and thinking it really captured the nuances very well. What many women seemed to need wasn't simply relationship education, it was confidence, it was boundaries, it was independence and conflict resolution skills, and permission to recognize that being alone might actually be healthier than trying to stay in a harmful relationship. Okay, so the third theme was sexuality. So for many people that have worked in this space for a really long time, I think this might not be surprising, but for me, and I suspect for some people that are here today, this was one of the more unexpected findings from this research. So before doing this study, when I thought about, what treatment for women convicted of child sexual abuse might focus on, I'd always assumed, it would be linked to sexual interests. But that wasn't really what emerged from my interviews with practitioners and these women. Now, that's not to say that sexual interests are irrelevant for women. For some, it might absolutely be relevant to their treatment. But what practitioners repeatedly told me was that sexuality often looked different for women. So many described offending as being connected to broader issues surrounding intimacy and validation and relationships and emotional regulation. In fact, most practitioners, they argued that focusing exclusively on sexual interest would actually miss a lot of the bigger picture. So they suggested instead to explore questions like, what role does sex play in relationships? Or how is intimacy understood? How is self-worth connected to sexual behavior? And how are boundaries established and how are they maintained? Interestingly, none of the women that were convicted of child sexual abuse in this study spoke to me about a sexual interest in children, nor did they identify it as a primary concern or an area that they would want to discuss during treatment. They did frequently bring it back to relationships and self-worth and trauma and identity instead. Now, I found that a little bit thought-provoking, and it did challenge me as well because it reinforced the importance of understanding the whole person rather than reducing somebody to their offense. The fourth theme was self-concepts. So practitioners, they repeatedly described low self-esteem, low self-worth as being at the core of many women's offending pathways. Now, they weren't talking about confidence in the superficial sense. They were talking about how these women often saw themselves, whether they believed that they deserved healthy relationships, whether they believed they could have a different future, whether they believed they were capable of change and really making something of themselves. And many women, they talked to me about shame. That's not surprising. This is one of the most heavily stigmatized offenses that's imaginable. But several women, they spoke about wanting to forgive themselves, not excuse themselves, not to minimize what had happened, but they wanted to find a way to move forward with the rest of their lives. So one woman described wanting to learn ways to stop hating herself. So she said that the more I talk about it, the more I hate myself for it. I've not forgiven myself, but I want to learn how to do this. Now, I think that quote, it captures something really, really important because if somebody fundamentally believes that they are irredeemable, that becomes really difficult to build motivation for change, which is something that we need to be doing if we want to engage these women in intervention and strategies for rehabilitation. Now, the practitioners I spoke with, they also commonly mentioned that lowered self-concepts were an important treatment area. And they mentioned that this should be approached quite differently when compared with men. So one practitioner said that for women, if we deal with her self-worth, if we deal with her self-value and all of those underpinning things, then we are actually addressing her criminogenic needs, unlike doing that to a man, which would just make him a happier offender. The final theme was parenting. And this was something that I hadn't really anticipated when I started the project, but it came up repeatedly. Many women that I spoke with were mothers, or they told me that they wanted to be, and many remained really deeply concerned about their children. Many worried about fractured relationships and child protection involvement and separation, and they worried about future reunification. Practitioners, they explained that parenting concerns, they often consume a significant emotional energy. And if those concerns aren't addressed, they can become barriers to treatment engagement. So several women, they described desperately wanting support with rebuilding relationships with their children. Others wanted guidance on healthy parenting practices. Many simply wanted help navigating incredibly complex child protection systems. So this became a responsivity issue more than anything else, really, and that addressing parenting concerns could help women engage more effectively with treatment, help them to develop future goals, and reconnect with important sources of meaning in their lives. So yeah, many of the treatment targets for women, they seemingly overlap with what is already often addressed for men, but importantly, they just don't look the same or often need to be approached a bit differently. Okay, so just to quickly recap, from the interviews, we now know that treatment is desired, and that there are some really important treatment topics like trauma and relationships and sexuality and self-concepts and parenting. But now we need to know more about how treatment should be delivered. So not theoretically, not conceptually, but just practically. If a correctional service approached me tomorrow and said, Bricklyn, you've convinced us, design a program, I would really want to know what the program should actually look like. So what would the room look like? Who would be facilitating it? What would the participants actually want if they were involved in this program? What would practitioners recommend works best for women specifically? And perhaps most importantly, what would make these women actually engage with it, complete it, and for it to be successful? So that's what I asked practitioners. That's what I asked these women. I said, if you could design the ideal program, what would it actually look like? Now, both the women that I spoke with and the practitioners that I spoke with, they had a lot of suggestions, but there wasn't a call to completely reinvent treatment. In fact, one of the strongest messages coming out of this particular study was that the women didn't necessarily want something that was entirely different. They just wanted something that was more responsive, something that recognized their experiences as women, something that felt relevant, something that acknowledged where they'd come from, but also helping them to think more about where they wanted to go. One of the first topics to emerge was the format of treatment, so group versus individual formats. Now, participants that I spoke with, they didn't really see this as this either or discussion. So many women, they valued group programs. They liked the idea generally of meeting other women who had similar experiences to them. They thought it would help to reduce isolation. It would help to reduce shame. It would help to learn from other people and help them to feel understood. Many described that they felt quite disconnected from their family, from their friends, from the broader community. And for some, the idea of sitting in a room with women who genuinely understood their experiences, it felt incredibly valuable to them. Now, others described the opportunity to support each other as something meaningful. And practitioners, they generally agreed with this too. So many explain that group environments, they can create these opportunities for accountability and for reflection and peer learning that's often really difficult to replicate elsewhere or in a different format. But at the same time, there was also this other side to the story. So while women, they valued group connection, many were also very much hesitant to discuss their offending in front of other people. Several of the women indicated they would feel really uncomfortable sharing deeply personal experiences in a group setting, and particularly experiences that involve details of their offending, so much so that they said that if group formats were the only option, they might not engage in the treatment at all. They also said they would very much hate to hear the specifics about another woman's offending. So as a result, many of the women I spoke with, they advocated for a combination of group and individual interventions. So group work for connection, individual work for more deeper offense exploration, group work for support, and individual work for accountability. So rather than treating these approaches as these competing alternatives, participants saw them as very complementary treatment formats. So the practitioners, they also suggested that engagement in these programs could be enhanced through more non-traditional type approaches. So several practitioners, they recommended and discussed the value of art-based therapy, more creative activities, more inclusion of mindfulness practices, and other therapeutic approaches that could sit alongside more traditional intervention. Another rationale for those suggestions was relatively simple. So many women that were arriving in treatment carrying these significant histories of trauma and shame and emotional distress. So the practitioners, they explained that having creative and reflective activities can make those really difficult conversations at least feel less confronting, while also helping these women to develop things like self-esteem and self-awareness and emotional regulation skills. The second theme that emerged was that treatment needed to be broader than the offense itself and the importance of that therapeutic environment. So many practitioners, they spoke about the importance of what's called wraparound support. So they discussed the need for stronger linkage and connections with mental health services, with substance use programs, with child protection and family support services, and practical assistance with release planning. Many of the women just wanted ongoing support. They wanted someone to talk to, someone who could help answer their questions, someone who could assist them in navigating the challenges that they knew would be awaiting them upon their release from custody. So what became really clear was that rehabilitation wasn't being viewed as this single program to be completed. Participants were describing this broader support system that could help women rebuild relationships and strengthen support networks and create this pathway forward. A related point was the need for therapeutic settings. Now, I wasn't specifically asking about prison design or correctional environments in this study, but it was notable that practitioners, they repeatedly brought the conversation back to the settings in which treatment occurs. So many describe correctional environments as places designed for security, control, and containment, and that's understandable because that's part of their purpose and function, but they also spoke about the challenges of trying to facilitate meaningful therapeutic work within environments that can feel restrictive, environments that can feel quite impersonal, and at times quite disconnected from the principles that underpin effective therapy. So several practitioners described wanting spaces that felt safer, that felt calmer, and more conducive to open conversation. Others talked about the importance of creating environments where women felt respected and valued and capable of change. Some practitioners went even further, and they suggested that we need to totally rethink where treatment occurs altogether. So several advocated for therapeutic community models that were separated from the broader prison environment and designed specifically to support the rehabilitation of these women. So they described environments that felt significantly less institutional and much more therapeutic, where there was access to outdoor spaces and shared activities, opportunities for informal conversation, spaces where women could develop things like trust and communication skills and supportive peer relationships. One practitioner described that women can bring food to treatment sessions, or the benefits of women bringing food to treatment sessions, and sitting together in this big circle and sharing experiences and supporting one another. Another spoke about the potential benefits of gardens and cooking activities and communal spaces that encourage, connection while also encouraging personal responsibility. And while these details, they might seem really big to some, or maybe small to some of you, the practitioners argued that they were incredibly important because the environment communicates something. It communicates what we believe rehabilitation is. It communicates whether people are viewed as capable of change, and it can communicate whether treatment is something that we genuinely value, or simply something that we say that we value. And I found that particularly interesting because I find that a lot of research has gone into, understanding treatment needs and informing program content. So what should be taught, what topics should be covered, what interventions should be used. But participants were really reinforcing that where treatment occurs, the environment in which it occurs also matters. So the fourth theme was relationships. Not participant relationships this time, but therapeutic relationships. So again and again, participants came back to the same point, that the relationship between the facilitator of the program or intervention and the participant really matters. It matters a lot. So practitioners, they talked about trust, respect, authenticity, and empathy. The women that I spoke with talked about wanting facilitators who were genuine. They wanted facilitators who listened, who challenged them when necessary, but who also treated them as human beings. One practitioner made a statement that I think really perfectly captures the essence of this finding, and they said that the largest influence on the positive therapeutic process is the relationship between the therapist and the participant. And after talking with all of these people during these interviews, I think they were probably right, because regardless of how sophisticated a program is, it's very difficult to engage people in meaningful change if they don't trust the person that's sitting across from them. A lot of the women that I spoke with also expressed a preference for female facilitators. Now, that wasn't a universal finding, but it did come up quite frequently, particularly among women who had histories, or talked to me about histories of abuse by men. For some participants, a female facilitator just felt safer to them. They felt more approachable, more relatable. It's not necessarily about excluding male practitioners from this process, but it's about recognizing how personal histories can influence things like engagement. Now, the final theme that emerged from this study was lived experience. So several women I talked to spoke to me about wanting to hear from people who had been through similar experiences and been able to successfully rebuild their lives, not as therapists, not as replacement professionals, but as mentors. So people who could provide them with more hope, people who could demonstrate to them that change is possible. Practitioners were generally supportive of that idea as well. So many talked to me about how lived experience mentors can play quite an important role in reducing things like isolation. They can help to enhance engagement and help women to visualize a future, beyond their conviction. So when I stepped back and I looked across all of the findings, all of the things that were shared with me up until this point, one thing came really clear to me, which is that these women and practitioners, they weren't necessarily asking for completely revolutionary treatment. They weren't asking for radically different programs. What they were asking for was they wanted treatment that felt relevant. They wanted treatment that was balancing accountability with support, and they wanted treatment that acknowledged where they'd come from, but also helping them to think about where they wanted to go. That then, of course, led me to another question. So if we have this, growing understanding of treatment needs, and if we have a growing understanding of, what effective delivery might look like, then why aren't these programs already formalized and readily available across all of Australia? So the next question was, if we're knowing all of this, why isn't it happening, or why isn't it happening more consistently? Because one of the things I kept hearing from my interviews was frustration. Frustration from women who couldn't access services in spite of wanting to access them. Frustration from practitioners who wanted to provide services, and just generally frustration about the lack of available programs. Now, it's one thing to say that we need better programs, but it's another thing entirely to make these types of programs actually happen. So for this study, I specifically asked those Australian correctional practitioners. So that was 11 interviews, 44 survey participants. And what came out of these interviews and survey, it did give me, honestly, a much greater appreciation of just how difficult program implementation can be. So one of the things that became clear very quickly was that the program wasn't a lack of motivation. And I think that's really important to say that the practitioners I spoke with, they genuinely wanted better outcomes for these women. Many were very passionate about rehabilitation. Many were actively advocating for improved services. Many recognized the limitations of existing approaches. So the challenge wasn't so much that people didn't care. The challenge was that they were operating within systems that presented quite significant barriers that needed to be overcome. So three broad barriers emerged from those interviews in the survey, and that was system level barriers, a lack of expertise and appropriate tools, and the third was attitudes and perceptions surrounding women who commit child sexual abuse. But if you're going to touch on each of those points, and the first barrier was probably the most substantial, and that was system level barriers. So, as I mentioned before, anybody who works or anyone who teaches or studies in criminology is probably very familiar with the ongoing tension between punishment and rehabilitation. It's not a new debate, it's one that's been happening for decades now. But what was really interesting for me was hearing practitioners describe just how that tension played out in their everyday work. So, many explained that correctional systems, they're primarily designed around things like security and containment and risk management. As I said before, that's understandable. It's a core part of their function. But those priorities, they don't always sit comfortably alongside therapeutic goals. So one practitioner said, our culture is what crucifies our ability to be rehabilitative and therapeutic. And I think that captures the frustration that many practitioners were describing. There was often a sense that rehabilitation was valued in principle, but a lot harder to prioritize in practice, particularly when resources are limited and competing priorities exist. Another issue that emerged was numbers. So women who commit child sexual abuse, they represent, a relatively small population. So as a result of this, practitioners described these ongoing challenges in securing things like resources to develop these specialized programs and to then maintain those types of services. Several participants, they talked about having to justify investments in programs for these relatively small groups of women. And while that might make sense from a resource allocation perspective, it does create this difficult situation because small numbers, we know, doesn't necessarily mean small needs. And the population, technically, it is relatively small compared with men who commit child sexual abuse and other women that are in custody, but the need for intervention remains. Practitioners, they also highlighted a range of logistical barriers. So women, they're often dispersed across multiple different facilities. Some are serving shorter sentences, some are housed in protection units, a lot of them are on remand, and others are moving between facilities all the time. So all of these factors were creating challenges when trying to establish and trying to maintain specialized programs. So even, where there is this support for intervention, delivering it consistently is just it's not straightforward. The second major barrier involved expertise and assessment. So many practitioners described to me that they felt somewhat unprepared to work with women who commit child sexual abuse, not because they lacked commitment, but because opportunities for specialized training were extremely limited for them. So many practitioners, they'd never received any formal training specific to this population. They described largely learning through experience, through trial and error, through consultation with colleagues, more self-directed learning. Several participants spoke about the difficulties of building, expertise in this area where there are relatively few opportunities for formal professional development, and that creates then an obvious challenge. How do we develop effective intervention if practitioners are not being adequately supported to then develop the necessary knowledge and skills to confidently work in this area? Assessment tools emerged as another issue. So many practitioners, they described that they had to rely on tools that were developed for men, and that doesn't automatically make those tools invalid, but it does raise some really important questions. So how accurately can these tools capture women's experiences? How well do they actually reflect women's offending pathways and risks at recidivism? What's actually missing? Um, and what impact can that have on treatment planning and decision making? Now, these are questions we don't actually have definitive answers to yet, but practitioners were really clearly telling me that this area remains one that requires a lot more attention and resourcing in order for them to more, effectively and confidently complete those assessments. So the final barrier was attitudes and perceptions. Now, practitioners, they describe two seemingly contradictory problems. On the one hand, women who commit child sexual abuse, they're often heavily stigmatized. So participants, they described encountering attitudes suggesting these women are beyond help, that they can't change, that they're undeserving of intervention, that punishment should take priority over rehabilitation. And then it's not difficult, to then see how those attitudes can create barriers to treatment. On the other hand, though, practitioners, they also described the opposite problem. So that's minimization. Several participants, they argued that female perpetrated child sexual abuse is sometimes taken less seriously than male perpetrated abuse, that people often underestimate the harm it causes, that they view women as less dangerous, or that female offending simply receives less attention. And what fascinated me about this was that these two narratives seemed to exist simultaneously. So women were being viewed as both uniquely shocking and also not particularly important, highly stigmatized and yet frequently overlooked as well. And so practitioners, they were suggesting that this paradox, it contributes to the lack of services that are available. Because if a problem is minimized, resources can be very difficult to secure. And if a population is heavily stigmatized, rehabilitation can become very difficult to prioritize over punishment. So when I started this research, I assumed the biggest challenge for me would be about identifying what good treatment or rehabilitation would look like for women. But by this point in my research, I realized that implementation actually might be the bigger challenge because many of the practitioners that I spoke with, they already had this fairly good sense of what these women needed, what these women wanted. What they lacked were the resources, the training, the tools, and the systemic support that was required to consistently deliver it. Okay, so after spending several years thinking about treatment and rehabilitation and program design and implementation, which was the focus of my PhD research, I found myself coming back to a different question. And that was, what about prevention? Because as important as rehabilitation is, and it's ultimately a response that occurs after the harm has already happened. So after a child's been harmed, after a family has been affected, after someone has already entered the criminal justice system. And while I think effective rehabilitation matters enormously, I think most of us would agree that prevention is always preferable. So thankfully, when I completed my interviews with these women, I had the foresight to actually ask this question. And really, this was by chance. It was actually outside the scope of my PhD thesis, but just something that I was genuinely curious about. So in these interviews, I asked these women to reflect on their lives, not on the offense itself, but on what came before it. I said, looking back on things now, what might have stopped or what might have helped to stop your offending? What support could have been useful? What opportunities were missed? One of the first things that struck me in their answers to these questions was that most women, they weren't describing a need for this highly specialized sexual offending program earlier in their life. They were mostly talking about needing supports that already exist in many communities. Supports that a lot of people access every day, but supports that for various different reasons either weren't available to them, they weren't accessible, or they weren't effective when they were needed. So three broad areas emerged. That was professional counseling, relationship support, and parenting support. So the first area was counseling. That's not particularly surprising given everything I shared with you earlier, but many women, they described those childhoods characterized by abuse and neglect and violence and instability and victimization. Others spoke about mental health difficulties, emotional distress, and quite significant life challenges. And as they reflected on these experiences, many of these women described wishing that they had access to someone who could help them process what was happening to them at that point. Someone to talk to, someone to listen, someone to help them make sense of their experiences. So several women reflected on looking back at their lives and realizing that many of the challenges they experienced had never really been addressed. One woman spoke about carrying trauma for years without ever having the opportunity to really properly work through it. Another described growing up around violence and instability and dysfunction up to the point where it just simply felt normal to her. So, looking back, many wondered whether earlier opportunities to talk with somebody, to process what they were experiencing, or access to support may have changed the trajectory of their lives. Now, that doesn't mean that counseling would have prevented their offending. Obviously, we know that human behavior is too complicated for that. But many women felt that earlier support may have altered the trajectory of their lives in other meaningful ways. The second area was relationships. So many women describe relationships that were characterized by control and coercion and intimidation and abuse. And they spoke about domestic violence in childhood and domestic violence in adulthood. Others described this emotional dependency. They talked about years or spending years of their life trying to maintain relationships that were actually causing them significant harm. So several women reflected that they never really learned what a healthy relationship looked like. Some wished they'd recognized warning signs earlier. They wanted assistance that was more direct and more practical. So they wanted access to earlier education to spot the red flags in relationships and what to do about those red flags. They also wanted assistance with leaving unhealthy relationships. So places to go, access to resources and support, and having help. The third area was parenting support. As I mentioned earlier, many women spoke about the challenges of parenting, so stress, isolation, financial pressure, relationship difficulties, managing these multiple responsibilities and navigating really complex family situations. Now, they weren't suggesting that parenting caused their offending, but they suggested that parenting was just one of the many pressures that were occurring within their already quite complicated lives. So they wanted more support as parents. They wanted practical guidance related to parenting, more emotional support, and assistance with navigating family services before the offense occurred. The significance of this study wasn't in just the types of supports that were desired, but it was about the barriers too. Because one of the questions I kept asking myself during interviews was if these services exist, which I know that they do, or that they largely do, why weren't they being used? So for some women, the issue was awareness. They simply didn't know where to go. Several women described not knowing what services existed, not knowing how to access the support, not knowing who to contact. And that's important because availability and accessibility are not the same thing. So a service can exist, but if we don't, or people don't know about it, if they don't trust it, or if they don't feel able to access it, its preventative potential is then significantly reduced. For other women, the barriers were more emotional, so fear and shame and embarrassment, fear of judgment, fear of the consequences, fear of not being believed. Perhaps the most confronting finding from this study, though, was that some women weren't describing an absence of help seeking, they were describing failed help seeking. In fact, there were instances where women did reach out. They did tell somebody, they did ask for help, but they felt that their concerns were dismissed or that their concerns were minimized or just not acted upon. So some described speaking with professionals. Others spoke about approaching schools and doctors and government agencies. And obviously, I've only heard one side of these interactions. But what struck me was that many women weren't describing a failure to seek support. They were describing situations where they felt support had not actually eventuated. That's an important distinction too, because prevention isn't simply about encouraging people to seek help. It's about how the systems are responding to them when they do. So for many women in this study, there were failures or at least perceived failures with support. I also think it's important, though, to clarify that not every woman that I spoke with believed intervention would have changed her pathway. So some openly acknowledged they may not have accepted help. Others said they didn't recognize that they had a problem at the time. Some felt the offending was unlikely to have been prevented regardless of what services were available to them. So we all know that prevention is really complicated. There's no single intervention that prevents all offending. There's no universal solution. But what this study offered instead was opportunities. So moments where support may have made a difference, moments where people reached out, moments where they didn't know how to, and moments where they didn't feel that they were able to. Also, moments where systems may have responded differently. So that brings me, I know I only have a little bit of time left, but it just brings me to some final reflections from this research journey before we wrap up today. So I just wanted to finish by reinforcing that when I started this work, I wasn't entirely sure where it would lead. At the time, I knew I was studying rehabilitation. I knew I was trying to understand what treatment should look like for women who commit these offenses. That became a really important part of this story, but it ended up being this much bigger story than I expected. I found myself increasingly interested in those practical realities. So, not what's happening in theory, but what is actually happening, what services are available, what support are women receiving, what are practitioners trying to achieve, and where are the gaps. Now, I don't think that this research provides all of those answers. If anything, I know that I probably have more questions than when I first started, but we know that we still know relatively little about effective intervention for women who commit child sexual abuse. There are very few studies internationally that have actually tracked this, and none involving really large samples. So we still also know relatively little about prevention. So we still have a lot to learn, and we still have a lot to learn too about how best to support practitioners that are working in this space. But what I do think this research has shown is that women and practitioners, they have really valuable perspectives that are often missing from these conversations. And when we take the time to listen to these perspectives, we start to gain this much richer understanding of both the challenges and the opportunities that can exist. Now, this research, it didn't stop with the completion of my PhD. I've been exploring these issues through other research, particularly through like prevention and early intervention opportunities for these women. I think that's where a lot of the really important questions now sit. So a lot more work is needed to better understand what effective prevention looks like, who prevention efforts should really be targeting, and how support can be provided before women come to the attention of the criminal justice system. There's a need to broaden these conversations further too. So my research focused on women, but there is increasing recognition that we need to better understand how prevention, intervention, and support might need to look different for First Nations women, as well as transgender and gender diverse individuals. Those questions, they were beyond the scope of my research that I'm sharing with you today, but they are areas that are generating increasing interest, and they definitely warrant a lot more attention in the years ahead. Sorry, I know I've gone a little bit over time. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, please feel free to email me directly or pop them in the chat, and I can respond to you later. As I mentioned at the start of this presentation, I'm also a core member of the SVRPU, or the Sexual Violence Research and Prevention Unit. So if you'd like to have access to the research of this unit or their contributions and networks and updates, you can join the mailing list. I've included the details on this slide. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you for attending this webinar. Please feel free to share our resources and let us know if you have any feedback. If you would like to learn more about our program, visit projectparadigm.com.au and be sure to tune in to the next webinar.